Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to be showing you how I built this round Paulownia table, complete with a walnut bow tie joint and an epoxy filled center. I hope that you enjoy this build. Stay tuned. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that you enjoy your stay. Make sure to go over to the library that I have listed on the channel and check out all of my other videos that I have to offer. Hope you enjoy them. Paulownia, also known in Japanese as kiri, is a very lightweight wood that's very fine-grained and warp resistant. It's actually also the fastest growing hardwood. This is my first time working with this wood, and I gotta say, I'm hooked. Alright, let's get started with the project. I picked up this slab while I was back in Montana for the holidays, and it had a small crack in one side of it that I needed to join with a bow tie joint so that the crack wouldn't grow over time. But I'm going to be honest, this first bow tie joint did not go as planned. So just like most bow tie joints that I do, I freehand draw the joint instead of using a template guide. And then I lay it out on the piece where I will be adding the bow tie joint to, like this Paulownia slab on that crack. And then I trace it out with a pencil, and then I use a router and a chisel to bore out the area where I will then pound the joint into the wood. I prefer not using a template guide because I tend to like the aesthetic look of one that I freehand draw and then just cut out so that it's not so uniform. I think it looks better. But because a joint like this is a bit small, there's a lot of room for error when you're using the router to cut out the section. Unfortunately, here in a second, you will see me make a mistake when it comes to this joint. And the reason being is because I had a minor eye infection where I had to close my left eye. And I still tried to do this boring with just one eye, which was pretty dumb. Probably one of the dumber things I've ever done. It was all going well, but like I said, when you're doing a custom bow tie joint like this, there is a lot of room for error, and you'll see here in a second when I lift the router that I went beyond the line, and man was I bummed out. But because I am a hopeful person, I tried to patch the hole before pounding in the bow tie joint and after, so that you couldn't notice the area that I went over the line. I'm going to tell you now that it didn't work out. Even though I do finish this bow tie joint, I end up coming back to it later on in the project after I do the first coat of epoxy, and I add a new bow tie joint that is a bit bigger and covers up the old one because it looked bad. It looked really bad. Now, in retrospect, I wish I would have just slowed down for a bit and not tried to fix this bow tie joint and move on with the project, because that ended up creating more work for myself in the end. I could have just went ahead and created a new bow tie joint and installed it, but I didn't. You live, you learn. Now, in preparation for filling the hole in the center of the slab with epoxy, I first used some liquid CA epoxy to fill in some of the cracks to try to help seal the thing up. This was the first bit of epoxy. And there'll be lots more. Then I used a small plane to plane down the bow tie joint. You can see there the mistake over there on the left. And I ended up trying to fill it with some more wood putty to try to mask it even more. I should have just replaced it, which I'll do later. After just a bit of hand sanding, I flipped the slab over so that I was then seeing the underside of what would be the tabletop, and I used some sheathing tape to tape off the bottom side of the hole. Now this plan almost worked, just like most of the steps in this project, they almost worked. Just remember the almost. So my plan was to fill the center with a deep pour epoxy that I will be dyeing with some mica powder, and everything worked out pretty well, but it did leak, which is unfortunate. If you're going to be doing an epoxy addition to a tabletop, or if you're doing a river table, something like that, and the epoxy is going to be over an inch thick, then you're going to need to use some sort of deep pour epoxy as opposed to a tabletop epoxy. I'll put links in the description below for what I use for this project. I will also put a link in the description below for this mica powder that I used to dye the epoxy. I really like the way that the color turned out. After fully mixing the first set of the deep pour epoxy, I went ahead and began adding it to the tabletop, starting with the cracks that were around the hole, and then I went ahead and filled the hole with a bit of epoxy. And of course, somehow my camera was shut off during the time when I did the pour. But don't worry, I'll be doing more pours. So you can see here, this is after the first night of it drying. It ended up leaking out the bottom side where that sheathing tape was, and the bow tie joint looks horrible. It was a hard day for sure. That was a hard day. But at least I was able to have half of the epoxy within the hole dry, so that then I could come back and do another coat. But before doing that, I went ahead and decided to add a new bow tie joint over top of the one that I thought that I could fix, but it ended up just looking really bad. So I just did a bigger bow tie joint that would sit over top and just cover everything up. And the good thing about this time when I was installing the bow tie joint is I didn't have an eye infection, and I had the use of both of my eyes, which I would recommend if you're using power tools. In all seriousness, please make sure that you are safe when you are using power tools, such as a plunge router, like the one that I'm using currently. Make sure that you do wear protection over your eyes, your mouth, and your ears, and take it slow. don't try to rush using these powerful tools. You might get hurt, and it's not worth risking it. A good tip if you are really worried about making a mistake when you're using a router to do a bow tie joint like this is to just do really small amounts for the first, or cut out just a really small amount for the very first pass so that you actually get the shape started, and then you can start to increase the depth of your plunge and then finish everything out with chisels and a mallet. I really enjoy the process of adding a bow tie joint to a slab like this. It takes a bit of time, but the aesthetic features as well as the support that the joint gives is well worth it. Once the area where the joint would be added was bored out, I added some Titebond 2 glue and used a piece of plywood in between the actual joint and the mallet to hammer it in. I really just kind of take my time with this. You don't want to hit one side too hard and break the bow tie joint before you even get it in there. From there, it was time to prep for the second half of that deep pour epoxy in the center of the table. Now, to do this, I first started out by sanding the area, scuffing it up so that the second layer of epoxy would actually adhere to the first layer of epoxy, and then I started mixing the deep pour epoxy. If you're going to be using this deep pour epoxy, really be sure to read through all of the instructions as thoroughly as you can. Set them next to your bed the night before so that you read through them as much as you can. This stuff is finicky. But the good news about this deep pour epoxy when you compare it to a tabletop epoxy is that the bubbles are not so much a problem. If you have never used a mica powder or some sort of coloring within epoxy, it is satisfying. I would definitely give it a try. One of the interesting things about this deep pour epoxy is that the curing time is much longer than tabletop epoxy. It's more like 72 hours of dry time. And if you're using a mica powder, the mica powder actually has a weight to it, so it will move during the time that it is curing. And so if you want a specific shape or a specific kind of look with the epoxy itself, you have to come back to it throughout that dry time and move it around. Get a stick and actually adjust the epoxy. But if you wait too long, you might catch it when it's sticky, and you don't want that. After that, it was time to prep the slab for another coat of epoxy. So to do this, I started sanding down the entire slab, starting with the bow tie joint, which I decided to leave elevated, and I'll talk more about that later on in the project. And then I moved on to sanding down the top and the underside of the slab. When I get to the underside to do the sanding, I had to remove the sheathing tape, which took just a bit of time, but it worked out pretty well. I think next time if I was to do this again, I would add a bead of glue underneath the sheathing tape to help prevent leaks. After the sanding was done, I pulled out my branding iron. If you haven't seen the video on my branding iron, make sure to check that out. But I wanted to make sure to brand the underside of the table before I did the epoxy. And you can see me doing that here. I love having this branding iron. It is so cool. After that, it was time to clean up the slab again to prep for another epoxy pour. But this time it'll be on the bottom side of the slab. There's going to be a lot of cleaning in these types of projects, is what I have realized, and it's best to just kind of do it as often as you can so that you keep things as clean as you can, especially when you're using this tabletop epoxy, because it is super finicky and it often will get bubbles and or just get different particles attached on the surface when it's drying. So just reduce as much of that as possible. I go back and forth on whether or not it is important or even necessary to do the underside of a table like this that's going to be used primarily indoors, and thus it's not as important to actually seal the wood up. But my OCD side always, or has lately been going for, or opting in to adding a coat and finishing the underside of a tabletop like this. And so I ended up doing two separate coats because the first coat didn't work out super well. It was more of like a seal coat and it had some bubbles, so then I had to sand it down as you saw me do just a minute ago, and then I did an additional coat, and it actually looked pretty good at the end of that. Once that coat had fully cured, I flipped it over and got to work on another coat on the top side of the table. If you're counting, let me know how many of this is, because I honestly just lost count at this point. So I started by doing some sanding with a higher grit paper so that I could prep the top to receive another coat of epoxy so that it would actually adhere. This is important, otherwise the following coat might not adhere and it could start to peel. I've seen this happen on the sides of tables where there is a thicker buildup of epoxy, and sometimes it'll just not adhere. It won't even really connect to the grain on the wood. So make sure you scuff it up. Each time I was able to pour down a layer of epoxy like this, it was so exciting and exhilarating to see the color blow up in your face in a metaphorical way to say it, but it looked really good. But the frustrating thing is that I kept having bubbles build up around the bow tie joint because of the bow tie joint not being perfect and there being little gaps in between the Paulownia wood and the wood that I use for the bow tie joint, which is black walnut, and it required me coming back to it a number of times and doing additional coats so that I didn't have the bubbles. And I would try to come back every time I was doing a pour. I try to come back as often as I could to pop the bubbles, but I pressed the dry time a little too much and ended up, as you can see there, making it real bad. It had a bunch of bubbles because it got a little bit burned by the torch. So I had to come back, pull back out my sander, sand it down, get it ready for another coat. And this happened a number of times. Definitely went through a good amount of the tabletop epoxy, and I kind of had to just keep working at it and being patient and not allowing myself to get too excited when I did the various pours, because they look great when they're wet, when the epoxy hasn't fully cured. But then once it slowly dries, there's always something that kind of pops up in the process. So patience was something that I certainly learned a bit more about during this project. But an added benefit to me doing so many layers of the tabletop epoxy and leaving the bow tie joint more elevated was that it kind of added this floating look to the bow tie joint. And because it was taller than the tabletop itself, but in line with the epoxy, made it kind of stand out a bit, which I ended up liking in the end. But this happened several times, and it definitely started to become a very frustrating thing. Felt like it was kind of a I don't know, a downer in my woodworking hobby relationship, whatever that means. Definitely was challenging. And I started to try kind of some other techniques, such as using a little bit of this quick drying, I think CH glue, to fill in some of the holes that kept bubbling. And this helped a bit. You may have seen me do something similar in one of my other projects where I did an epoxy job like this, and I used some hot glue. And that actually worked pretty well. You can see it a little bit more than you can the CH glue, so I'd recommend the CH glue, but this was kind of something that I just tried. I don't know if I'd recommend it. It's up to your standards. I think in the end I was still able to make this look nice, and I probably notice it more than anybody else is going to. But when you get to a spot like this where you're stressed and you want to finish this project, you've been working on it for weeks, and you're ready to move on to something else, it really does test your ability to continue on doing a hobby like this. Working with wood and being a weekend woodworker. But I'm grateful in the end for the experience, and now I have an even better relationship with woodworking. Now, by this time in the project, I definitely have figured out a good method of mixing this tabletop epoxy. So, as the old adage goes, practice does really make perfect. I want to say perfect. I don't think anything's perfect, but it definitely helps you get better at something. The next morning I came out to the table and I thought that it was going to be finished, but once again there was just a few tiny little bubbles around the bow tie joint that I needed to do another coat over top of. But before doing that, I flipped over the table and used a pretty low grit sandpaper to sand off the bubbles on the underside, and then I gave the entire table another sanding. Whenever I would go to sand over the glossy top during these sanding sessions in between the various coats that I've done on this table, it was kind of sad to see, see the glossy, beautiful finish get destroyed by sandpaper. I'm not gonna lie. But seeing this slab evolve into this piece that will last truly a long time, this thing is going to be difficult to break down in any way. It's satisfying, and it makes me realize the importance of doing every step to the best possible outcome, if that's how you say it. What you saw me doing there in these last few bits of footage from the build is me attempting to do a wet sand all the way down to 1200 grit paper with water to actually just completely buff out all of the scratches. But in the midst of that, I sanded the area around the around the bow tie joint just a bit too much. I was wanting to give it a little bit of a angle to it, or some depth to the bow tie joint. And then I ended up sanding the finish all the way off. So I ended up going for one more coat. I think this is the last one, and it looked really good. At this point was I so excited, let me tell you. It was a good feeling to be able to finally not have to prep for another coat of epoxy. Hallelujah. So after rough sanding off the drips on the underside of the table, I then decided to use a new polish, an epoxy polish, or I guess it's an epoxy polish, that I found through another YouTube video. I'll put a link in the description below, and I'll put a link in the description for this product because it really worked well. The best thing that I've used with epoxy thus far for buffing out scratches. Now, I have only used this product this one time, so I'm not exactly sure the best way to apply it, but the way that I did it is I first started sanding it into the epoxy with 1200 grit sandpaper. This is after I'd sanded everything down to a really high grit, and then I moved on to using this foam buffing pad that I can attach to my circular sander to just buff it into the table as best as I could. It just takes some time, but it really actually made a nice shimmer that seemed to hold on the bottom side of the table. So I definitely recommend giving this product a try. And just so you know, I am not getting paid to endorse this product. Thus far, I have never been paid to endorse a product. I just recommend them if they've worked out well for me. The affiliate link down below to the actual product in Amazon does give me a small commission. I think it's 4% for most products that are sold on Amazon, meaning that if you buy it, I get 4% of that sale. So it's not much, but it's a little bit. It does help the channel out just a bit. So if you're interested in helping my channel out, give it a try, or give one of those affiliate links a try, but no pressure. Hope that this channel is as helpful to you. Now, what you have been watching me do is attach 4 hairpin legs to the underside of this coffee table. And you noticed, or hopefully you noticed, that I pre-drilled the holes for where I would be screwing in the screws that are actually included with these hairpin legs, which is nice. And you may have noticed that I have a piece of masking tape that is attached to the drill bit so that I know how deep to bore those holes. Didn't want to go too far. And at this point, the project was complete, or at least complete in my mind. I was done with it, ready to move on, and I was satisfied with the result. Let me know what you think. I think this is a pretty cool project. It's a fun idea. It took a while. It was challenging, but in the end, I think it was worth it. Alright folks, thank you for sticking around to the very end of another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb, and I hope that you enjoyed. Questions, comments, leave them below. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't. Get in the shop and build something cool.